What if I told you that the best Pokemon game was created in 2013 but it was never completed? I thought it was forever lost to time and space behind a launcher that refused to download the game no matter what I did, but I managed to find a working version, and today I'll show you the forbidden Pokemon game we deserve but never got. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not American, and my first exposure to Pokemon was through the TV show rather than the handheld gaming device. Don't get me wrong, I love the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games like Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Emerald, but something really stuck out for me while playing them. A lot of Pokemon's fans played the game before watching the series, so for them they got to see the game they played come to life and maybe expanded upon. For me, going from the show to the game, it felt like it was a stricter version of the show and it was maybe limited by the hardware or lack of creativity. In the show you could see the Pokemon actively battle, dodge the attacks in the last second, and they did many cool things that you can never do in a turn-based Pokemon game. Despite absolutely loving the game and enjoying it so much, I never understood why we were giving commands to our Pokemon and letting the game roll the dice instead of actively controlling the Pokemon, evading the enemy's attack while trying to hit them in a 3D battle plane. There were many more differences between the show and the game that stood out to me. Like the fact that in the show they constantly run into random cool Pokemon and not a predetermined set based on your location. In the show, if you make a Pokemon faint, you can actually capture it instead of losing it forever to the ether like in the games. I understand that these were all choices that were made in the interest of making the game more balanced and challenging, but I would have loved to play a game that's more true to the show than what we've always had. We have seen some of those cool features implemented in unique mods or fan-made games, like in the Minecraft mod Pixelmon, where you can just walk around the map and see random cool Pokemon everywhere. You also have Pokemon Go, where you actually need to aim and hit the Pokemon with your Pokeball to capture it. We saw many more bits and pieces in other games that were true to the show, but never the whole thing in a complete package. At least not until 2013, where we received Pokemon Generations, a 3D Pokemon game that was created by a fan of the series, who, like many of us, always wanted a 3D Pokemon game where you take a more active role in battle. At first he published a clunky initial version that was kinda meh, and he refined it over time. Eventually we got the second version that was way better with more Pokemon, better controls, and even the ability to create a server to play against other players and your friends. This is where the crazy hype began back in the day. Keep in mind that this was a proof of concept and it lacked a lot of polish, but it was great nevertheless. So the first thing you can do in the game is catch a random Pokemon to begin your yet to be developed adventure. To achieve that, you need to aim your Pokeball and actually hit the chosen Pokemon you desire to be your starter. It could definitely use more refinement, but it was the right idea. Now that you have your Pokemon, you can take it out of its Pokeball and engage other Pokemon in battle. You have several attacks you can switch between with your keyboard and execute them after aiming with your mouse and left clicking. Each attack consumes stamina, so you won't be able to spam moves, and it also serves as a way to balance the overpowered move. Maybe your most powerful attack consumes all of your stamina, so now you have to wait and dodge while you recover your stamina. You can immediately see the potential for such a game and how great it is when you have a well-timed withdraw attack with Squirtle that actually does something, or when you successfully hit a Leech Seed and it slightly heals you up. If you manage to make that wild Pokemon faint, you can actually capture it by successfully aiming and hitting its unconscious form with your Pokeball. Just with these few basic features, you can see why this game had so much hype, and if you would have asked me back then what game I wanted to be fully completed and come out at that time, it would be a close tie between this game and Shenmue 3, but I digress. If you have a flying Pokemon at your disposal, it's actually harder to hit you because you can use your stamina to fly up and be unreachable for most of your enemies' attacks. Now instead of using the regular boring ground, you can actually walk to the pond with small ice patches that you can stand on, where swimming in the water is also a possibility. Now I'm pretty sure this isn't part of the game, but imagine if recently entering water enhances the damage of electric type attacks against a wet enemy. And if you hit the body of water with an electric attack, it electrocutes the enemy if it touches the water. There's so much potential for realism in this game, and keep in mind that when I say realism I mean within the Pokemon universe based on the show. I know that having pocket monsters in balls that you force to fight isn't exactly realistic. A game like this being created was obvious to me as a child. It's one of those things that if we had it I would have died happy. I never understood why there was never even an attempt to make such a game officially, and why the copyright holders of this game never even thought or teased the idea of making such a game. After taking a deep dive and thinking more critically, I can see why it was never made. For one, making the classic Pokemon games is much easier in terms of programming. Movement on a grid-based 2D plane is way easier than games that are fully 3D. 2D assets are easier to create and animate. It's easier to program an AI who would pick the right move in a turn-based game compared to one that would fight and be challenging in a 3D fighting game. The classic games always sell like crazy, so I switch up a winning formula and draw attention away from an already successful and very easy to make game. In terms of balancing, it's way easier to balance a turn-based game and avoid the headaches that come with real-time fighting and move spam. One more factor into a 3D game being less likely to be developed was the fact that the Nintendo handheld consoles back then had no analog stick natively until 2011, and the hardware was probably too weak to handle such a game in a multiplayer environment. Just take a look at the most recent quote-unquote 3D Pokemon titles on the Switch. There are still FPS drops on Pokemon Scarlet, which is not visually impressive game and it's not grand in scale at all. In fact, nothing about these games is particularly impressive or refreshing. So from the looks of it, it seems like Nintendo never had the right hardware at any point in time to allow a 3D multiplayer title like Pokemon Generations. On top of that, there was no financial incentive at all to create it. Maybe even the opposite. That's why the only hope that was left is that the game would be created by a fan. So why was it never finished? Starting with the obvious, the developer abandoned the title and it's easy to see why. A free-to-play game like this, with such a large scope and no financial backing, is impossible for any indie developer who's not swimming in money. The saddest part is that as soon as the game becomes financially viable or maybe the game just breaks even, in the best case scenario, the game would be completely shut down by Nintendo, who are very heavy-handed in how they handle copyright issues. In the worst case scenario, the dev would get sued and pay a large amount of money in compensation for the copyright holders. The old style of Pokemon games is going stale. You can create 500 more trash Begomons, we don't really care. The Pokemon crowd needs innovation. That's why YouTube is filled with videos that show unique Pokemon mods with millions of views. That's why Palworld, a Pokemon game combined with Arc, is so successful. You know why? Because it's not a turn-based same old recipe for 30 years. It's a 3D game where you can actually put your Pokemon to work and they're tied directly to progression in the game in a more engaging way. The gameplay loop is absolutely phenomenal compared to the boring old level up a starter and get 1 or 2 more strong Pokemons in case the starter dies. I wish there was a game like Pokemon Generations today with a little bit more polish, more Pokemon to capture and a larger world. Even as a proof of concept from 2013, Pokemon Generations looks way more fun and inviting than all modern Pokemon games combined. After doing a quick research, it seems like there is a spiritual successor called Pokemon 3D Spirit, but it looks better only in terms of graphics from what I've seen. The combat is still a little bit clunky, so we will have to wait on. Before you leave, make sure to take a look at another deep dive video I made that is currently on screen.